Our second launch was successful. We had put 12 NASA satellites into pretty much a perfect orbit. A space launch is very much, I'd say, a spiritual event, because you have this community who has been focused on this project and has put years of their life into what occurs over an hour. That's the trap that the Challenger got into. That's the trap that the Columbia kind of got into. And every other big disaster in space, it's when the organization goes on automatic and assumes that because it worked yesterday, it's going to work tomorrow.
Hello everyone, my name is Eugeniusz Romer. Welcome to the YouTube channel of Układ Sił. This is a foreign policy magazine from Poland. And today we have a great pleasure to interview Mr. Dan Hart, a president of Hart Technologies and a former CEO of Virgin Orbit. Welcome, sir.
Great to be here.
So before you started Virgin Orbit, you actually worked a lot of time, more than 30 years, at Boeing. So I would like to start from this. As far as I know, you took part, you were working in a space branch, and you developed technologies in terms of satellites, space shuttles, defense industry, and also you participated in manned missions. So what was your role then?
Well, you know, I got the space bug kind of early, right out of college. So I found my way from New York to Kennedy Space Center when I graduated college, and I was fortunate enough to be working on the early space shuttle days on a program called Space Lab, which was actually the first large-scale U.S.-European collaboration. So it was an incredibly exciting time. The Apollo Gemini generation were handing over the reins to a new group of upstarts, and I was lucky enough to be one of them. So that's how I got my start. And then, as you just said, you know, I proceeded along after the Challenger accident. And the space shuttle had a pause. I went over to Cape Canaveral and launched Delta rockets. I came to Huntington Beach, California, and worked on satellites, and then larger Delta rockets, missile defense systems, and satellites of all types, and then came over to Virgin.
So which part of this work for Boeing was most challenging for you?
Well, you know, every single program had its own personality and its own challenges. I actually came in to McDonnell Douglas at the time, which was eventually acquired by Boeing. And I actually was able to work in a number of different aerospace or space-related companies, because at the time there was a fair amount of consolidation going on. So McDonnell Douglas merged with Boeing, merged with Hughes, merged with Rocketdyne. You know, the space shuttle was very interesting. It was an exciting program. It was a program of new partnerships. I was on loan for a year as a 23-year-old to Dornier Systems in Germany, for instance, you know, which I was pretty young. So that had its challenges. Of course, when there was a human spaceflight accident, that was a huge challenge, both for the program as well as everyone who was working on it. Coming over to Cape Canaveral, it was a program that was going out of business. It was a 1960s rocket program that had all of the flavors of that, and modernizing it and bringing it into the commercial sector and bringing it into new government programs, launching GPS systems. Those were all new. And certainly building larger rockets. The Delta IV family was an enormous LOX hydrogen system. And I was given a very challenging role of being the systems engineer for the system. And so, you know, every single part had its own challenges: personal growth, technical growth, really interesting programs.
So I know you were doing engineering stuff, but I will ask you about emotions as well. What kind of emotions do you have when you see your, for example, rocket reaching space, or people who or in this rocket they are reaching, for example, ISS. What kind of feelings are attached to such a moment?
Well, you know, there's a multitude of layers. I would say, first of all, a space launch is very much, I'd say, a spiritual event, because you have this community who has been focused on this project and has put years of their life into what occurs over an hour in a day. And I remember in the mid-2000s, I was launching quite a bit. I was running the satellite programs for the government sector at Boeing at the time. We were launching every 2 to 3 months. And I took the opportunity at one point to, instead of watching the data and the rocket in the final moments of countdown, to look at the team, the people. And these were people who had launched 50, 100 times or more. And I watched them as they got closer to the launch moment. And you saw their eyes go from the screens to the rocket in the distance. And you saw them, for some reason, all starting to stand up. And then, you know, you just saw this look of anticipation in their eyes. And it's a real coming together. It's a real moment of, you know, there's a lot of stress, but there's this moment of something important is going to happen. And that's really at the core of space launch.
And there is also a lot of responsibility. So how did you handle this responsibility that you bore during your missions? Especially, I think, when you're responsible not only for really large budgets of those programs, but also for the people who are on a star spacecraft.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a whole psychology associated with leadership in space launch. And to your point, the most important part is when you have people that you're responsible for and for their safety, and how you behave with the team and the kind of behavior you try to encourage in the team is everything. You know, what you shoot for is an openness, you know, a drive to a goal, but balanced with an openness to where there's a real appreciation and a desire to hear of issues, problems, concerns. And I think, you know, so as far as the stress is especially in a startup company, a private company like Virgin Orbit. Mm-hmm. There's only one place where all of the responsibility sits, and that's at the CEO level. And you feel that. I mean, you feel that every day as you walk out of the building, you know, and you think about the day and you think about the people and interactions and how they went well and how they didn't, and how you want tomorrow to improve and push the company forward. But most importantly, you think about, is there any kind of concerns that people are reluctant to bring up, and how do you model for them? I mean, so there were days, for instance, where I knew that the team was striving hard to make a launch date, and those were probably the days where you wanted to model interest and curiosity on and a willingness to stop if there was a safety-related issue or if somebody had a problem. And oftentimes when you do that, the team will come around it and they will analyze it, and they'll find a way forward, maybe not the current plan. But if you don't do that, if you don't actually force the team to sometimes stop or and rethink, oftentimes people will just fall in line because they assume that the greater organization somehow has it under control, which is the trap. I mean, that's the trap that the Challenger got into. That's the trap that the Columbia kind of got into. And every other big disaster in space It's when the organization goes on automatic and assumes that because it worked yesterday, it's going to work tomorrow. And so I'd say those are the techniques, and you feel that strain every day. You feel the strain to make schedule and cost, but most importantly, you feel the responsibility for the people.
So space is hard, and this is also important to know human psychology, not only the engineering stuff. But coming to Virgin Orbit that you already mentioned. So you came up with quite innovative technology, maybe somehow related to the space shuttle. But how was it? How did you come up with this idea to launch rockets not from the ground but from a plane?
Well, so to be perfectly honest, the idea of doing it came about before I arrived. Okay, so I came to the company in 2017. It was actually part of Virgin Galactic at the time. And what they had done was, they were working on space tourism, where a mothership carries a spaceship to a fairly high altitude, 40,000 plus feet, and then drops it, and the spaceship takes off, and basically getting the benefit of the air breather, the airplane, to get altitude and velocity so that the spaceship can gain further altitude. That was the core, and it was an R&D effort, research and development. They were working on this. They had done a fair amount of preliminary design and had started to create some hardware. And they realized that this was going to be a major effort. And the vehicle had grown. It had started with a common ship to the Virgin Galactic ship, and had grown into a 747 aircraft, because the rocket had grown from a small rocket to a small-ish rocket. It was about 70 feet long, about 60,000 pounds, but it's a significant amount. And so what they realized in 2016 really was that if this was going to actually become a reality, they were going to have to shift gears from an R&D effort into a real development effort. And they made the decision to spin off to a different company and set up a leadership and a separate brand and a company. And that's when they asked me to come over. So that was the idea. And so I came in, the company was already on the order of a couple hundred people working on engines and some structures and some avionics, but without a real drive to develop, to actually get it done. I came in, we didn't know if it would work. But it was an interesting idea. It was certainly a very new technology. A liquid rocket flying from an air-launched platform had never been done. It was an interesting challenge, as well as it was a growing commercial and, to some extent, national security space launch. And so I came in to do it.
And eventually it's turned out to be successful to some extent, because you managed to launch some rockets successfully and deliver some satellites to the orbits. So how successful, in your opinion, this technology was? Because at the end of the day, we know now that Virgin Orbit went bankrupt. So how was it in your...
Well, I mean, the development program was enormously successful. We had a new method, a new technology for launching. We had our first flight failed after, a handful of seconds of flight, but we got enough data out of that flight, and to the team's credit, they really juiced the telemetry that they got to where they took all the lessons learned of environments and how air launch is different than ground launch, and the effects on the subsystems. And in our second flight was, to our astonishment to some degree, 100% successful. Every single satellite was put into the right orbit, which, by the way, A lot of launch companies kind of bend the success criteria as they grade their performance on missions. The success in a space launch mission means the satellite got to their requirement. So anyway, our second launch was successful. We had put 12 NASA satellites into pretty much a perfect orbit. We then did another mission about 6 months later in the middle of 2021. That was 100% successful. We put another 7, 8 satellites into orbit, this time for the US Space Force. And then we did 2 more very, very successful missions. So from a technology, a development program point of view, I would say it was a very successul program.
So what went wrong?
So there were, so now we can get into, okay, well, now what happened? Well, there's a number of things. Number one is our first mission happened in, it was the end of May of 2020, and there was something else that was happening in the end of May in 2020, and that was COVID had hit full bore. So here we are in a manufacturing and space launch program doing a launch where we can't really even sit together. So, I would say COVID, we operated through, we did everything I just talked about, but it tapped us out. I mean, our operational efficiency was, if it was 50%, I'd say, that might be an exaggeration. So that was difficult to be at your highest spend rate, at your highest peak operational drive in the middle of COVID. So that was costing us and our investors a fair amount of money. Second, so what our investors had talked to us about, and what we eventually did was we went into this SPAC activity in 2021 with the idea of raising additional capital. And a SPAC is a methodology or a method of basically taking a private company public through a merger, special merger, with in this case, more of a financial company. So we did our SPAC. Unfortunately, the timing of all of that and the SPAC activity took us public at the end of 2021. And that was when inflation started to really rise. The threat of interest rates going up was, I don't remember if they had actually gone up much, but there was clearly writing on the wall. And the financial sector started to pull back on the reins.
They were looking for safe havens.
Yeah, so what happened was, as we went public with the idea that we would be able to get into the public markets and raise money, capital that way, because our primary supporters had been significantly affected by COVID. I mean, Virgin Travel and Leisure, investment company primarily. So we moved into the public sector exactly as the public sector moved away from aspirational space kind of activities. Right. And all of 2022, sorry, we spent our time working with the public sector, working with investors, but it was a pretty much of a closed market. There weren't any deals happening. We knew we had a certain amount of runway, but everything had to go right. And if you look across at our competitors, if you look across at the space sector, it's hard to find an example where everything goes right. Now, we buckled down, and to the team's credit, we drove forward, into this unknown, knowing there was a limited road ahead. But that was the main issue. And then there are secondary issues associated with that. We had competitors who were poaching our people, who our closest competitor had 3 times the amount of capital we did. So you could see, people doing the math and moving into other companies, which slows you down also. The market had shifted, and that had also impacted us. So, we went into this largely as a commercial launch provider, OneWeb was going to be a primary company, a lot of the others. SpaceX had come in during that period with their transporter missions and really undercut the new small launch companies. You know, and we were impacted, Rocket Lab was impacted, others were impacted. And so we needed to shift to government, and government is a bit slow. So you had a few of these things happening, and they sort of added up to enormous strain. And you know, eventually we just ran out of money. You know, and if you look at how others have survived, you know, if you look at our competitors, it's taking a while for them to garner any real earnings in this sector. Mm-hmm. You know, even SpaceX there's not big headlines about making large sums in space launch. It's helping them in human space flight. It's helping, you know, certainly Starlink is a really great venture. Rocket Lab diversified. We were going to diversify. Our plan was to diversify, but again, we were limited in cash and couldn't diversify.
So many, let's say, negative events, they crossed at the same time, and this caused your, caused the fact that you run out of money. But if we are discussing the financial model, so you mentioned a few of them. So having this experience, how do you think which model is the best, or maybe for companies not only from the US but also from Poland, where, you know, the capital is not so abundant? So is it like government spending, or maybe going public and on a stock, seeking for investors at a stock exchange, or maybe finding some, let's say, side businesses? Because you also tried this, as you mentioned. As far as I know, we were making, for example, ventilators. So to finance the main project, the chasing of your dreams, which is launching rockets.
Well, first of all, let's talk about ventilators. We built ventilators not to make money, but because it was the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. You know, we contacted the governor's office in the middle of 2020 when people were dying because they didn't have breathing equipment, and we just asked, what can we do? And we were connected to a couple of universities, and we ended up building 600 ventilators and you know, and delivering those, sure, you know, in pretty quick order. That wasn't a business decision. That was a humanitarian mm-hmm. decision. And there were a couple of others like that. In terms of business models, it's a great question. I would say, from an investor's point of view, you know, it's important to realize that we are still in a dynamic market in space, and there are shifts and changes happening in the marketplace. What is commercial is sort of has many different faces to it. And a lot of commercial companies, for instance, now especially, have shifted a lot of their revenue targets to government. Even the most, you know, all of them, frankly, if you peel back the onion a little bit, have a large amount, 50% or 3/4 of their revenue coming from government programs. The one big exception are some of the communications companies, because there's our thirst for communication is enormous, and our expectations of how quickly we should get data change day to day. And so the large communication infrastructure via broadband or now direct to cellular, direct to devices in an interesting sector. IoT is a growing sector that are strictly commercial. But even in those, there's an underpinning of government. So we had shifted our business model to heavily focus on government. And I would say most companies are doing that. And that is something important to look at. Now, the tricky part for us was we were already in full motion, and we had a fair amount of burn to keep the operation going. I think what companies need to trade off is, does it make sense to create the product and develop the market, or in traditional government contracting, what one does typically is you create a little bit, you get government contracts, and you respond to them, and you build up. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing probably more of that, whether it's in national defense, whether it's in something like lunar exploration. I think we're going to see more focus on government. We're certainly seeing that, and response to government.
And how marketing is important in financial success, because I think of Elon Musk, and he used to say, for example, that spacesuits, they should look like space tuxedos. And it shows that he was putting a lot of stress in order to make space industry, let's say, somehow fancy, right? So how do you think that marketing and, for example, expressing your goals, like we want to establish colonies on Mars, this kind of stuff, how does this help you financially succeed?
Well, I mean, I think Elon Musk caught the eye of a number of investors through doing that, and that has helped fuel his enterprise. It also helped internally, I think, to, there's a new generation coming into space, and there has been over the last 10 years, and I think that fueled the imagination of his team. Right. I don't think that necessarily impacted the nuts and bolts of his real, CFO business strategy. And I don't know that it, in the end of the day, that it really does. In the end of the day, what affects the revenue and the bottom line is whether you can sell the product for more than it costs for you to make it. But certainly those kinds of, that's an aspect of marketing. That's more branding, I think, which certainly has helped. I think the investor community and the markets themselves are much more savvy now than they were 10 years ago when that started. And it's probably a little harder now to, say, hey, we're gonna fly to Jupiter and we're gonna pull methane out or something as a venture to invest in to make money.
So at the end of the day, the money, the calculations are the most important things. So maybe I would like to come back to the Launcher One technology, because you said it was very successful and it could be commercialized, but eventually it wasn't, but it's still a great technology, right? So what happened to it? Did you sell it to someone, or are you maybe planning in the future using it?
Well, Virgin Management took ownership of the technology, and it's actually existing currently on a whole array of drives. We are currently licensing this technology, and so there are companies who are tapping in. I mean, there's amazing technology on how to do the overall air launch activity, how to maintain propellant, how to load propellant in this kind of configuration. Engines, avionics, guidance navigation. I mean, we flew off the airplane after a delay, and we operated with a very high angle of attack, a very unique flight profile for a rocket, and we did it successfully. So it's existing, and companies are tapping into it, and there are some companies looking at really reviving the whole concept, which I'll be surprised if that doesn't happen.
And what are other technologies we can envision right now? Because when we think about rocket launching, we think about ground launching, but you proved that this is not the only alternative, right? You can do it from a plane, but some scientists, for example, they say that maybe we can use solar wind, but this is kind of slow, but still this is something different than chemical propulsion. So do you think that in the future we can develop some new technologies?
Well, we certainly can, and for space launch to really get to the next level, will have to. I mean, you know, right now there are companies working on more and more reusability. I think there's a whole host of technologies in thermal protection and flight control associated with that. That will happen. There are people working on nuclear propulsion, which is something that, I mean, was thought of in the 1950s, really. But it's like it sounds. It can be tricky, and whether that's used for boost stage versus upper stage, you know, probably start with upper stages. But that would be a huge change, because what you want is, like with cars, you want more miles per gallon on your rocket. So less propellant and more velocity. So nuclear propulsion will be one of the big ones. There are people working on very low orbits, and so that's a very interesting area where airplanes breathe air in and force it out the back. There are companies working on spacecraft that can go, they're not going to be at 30,000 miles, but maybe at 100 miles, and actually breathe above the stratosphere and makes satellites that don't have to have propellant tanks. So, and then in the communications area, what I'm very excited about is laser communications, because there's right now what holds back communications often is the risk that they're going to interfere with each other. And there's a very complicated, and I'd say very successful operation through the UN called the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, where countries participate to divvy out spectrum. But with lasers in space, it's like fiber optics. And you can have satellites talking to satellites or satellites talking to the ground without the need of radio. So there's some really interesting technologies.
So if it comes to lasers, do you think they can be also used as a weapon to jam satellites or blind them in somehow?
Well, certainly it can. I mean, it can, you know, it can be used to dazzle satellites. It can be used probably to do worse than that. I mean, we've seen what lasers can do on the ground. There's not a difference in space. They're probably more effective because there's less interference from them from the atmosphere. And so, you know, the whole area of space as a contested environment where aggression can happen is something of huge concern, which, you know, if you take the long view, is probably the biggest threat to our advancement in space.
So, for example, one of my interviewees, recent ones, he said he's worried of the fact that one country which does not have really developed space technologies, may cause some kind of explosion, for example, at LEO or GEO, in order to jam enemy satellites. So do you think this is something that we should worry about?
I think it's a real risk. And I think we need to double down our efforts on how we collaborate in space. We know that there will be tensions because space assets are used, satellites are used for intelligence, they're used for communication, they're used for missile warning, they're used for military uses. So there are these important assets in there that support countries' national defense. That's going to happen. We need to continue on and expand things like the Artemis Accords. That's what the U.S. has signed about 42 agreements saying let's use space as a collaborative, as a peaceful arena. And there's the UN treaty that was signed in 1967 for space as a peaceful, or the peaceful use of space. Unfortunately, right now what we've got is space is reflecting the world. And so we have the U.S. and our allies, we have China and Russia and their allies, and there's two different groups. And what needs to happen is those two groups need to drill through their differences, and they need to find ways to collaborate.
Do you think this is possible?
I'm sure it's possible. It's a matter of desire of the leaders. and leadership. I just wrote an article that was posted on the Atlantic Council in their publication on China and the U.S. need to work together in space. And what I put forth in that is, let's do the easy first. We already have an agreement, for instance, that in space, if, very much like in the maritime world, if there are astronauts in trouble, that other countries are bound, if they have space assets, to come to their rescue. We already have that agreement. It was signed in 1967, and China came in a little later. But it's a hollow agreement if you don't put work to it, right? Because how could a Chinese astronaut help an American astronaut, or vice versa, if they don't have the interface equipment to do so? So why don't we just build on what we've already agreed to? Why don't we just now get together and say, okay, what are the valves in your system? You know, how do we interface to them? Because we want to make sure that there's a little box when we go to the moon, and you go to the moon. We want to make sure there's a little box of emergency equipment, and here's how to help a Chinese astronaut if they're in trouble. Wouldn't that be a great way to just start to break the ice and collaborate?
Right, but I think now we are going in the opposite direction. For example, one of the main causes of the success of SpaceX was actually the fact that the Russians stopped, or the Americans stopped using Russian rockets to deliver astronauts to ISS because of the fact that Russians invaded Crimea. Just in this case, when there will be no talks and no successful talks, as you were talking about, do you think that the US should maybe militarize space in order to secure it as it does now in the common goods as oceans, for example, and seas?
Well, it's interesting that you should bring that up, because in truth, the US and Russia even are still collaborating in space. I think it was in August when an American astronaut came down on a Soyuz spacecraft.
All right.
So it's not in the headlines anymore. It's almost like it's in the back door, but we are seeing the agreement continue on. So I would say that we should build on that. We should recognize that even in our worst hours, we have the ability to have collaboration, and it's really only through doing that we're going to avoid war in space. You know, yes, what you just said is going to happen. There will be a militarization happening in space. I mean, it's, you know, you want to. It starts with protecting the assets you have there, but that's not our best way as humanity, is it? You know, it's a tendency we have, but you know, I was reading, when I wrote my article, I was reading some of the communication that was happening in the 1960s and the 50s. President Eisenhower, one of the greatest generals that the United States ever had, made the point that unless we focus on collaboration, we will go to war. And so, you know, you have a choice, and leaders have a choice. It's harder to focus on our better angels than our darker angels, but we have a choice, and we should make that choice to collaborate, to open up space for all of humankind, and you know, and allow us to as a species communicate and understand our world and protect it.
Yeah, and I think that many people who work actually in the space industry, they think this way because they see Earth from space, and you can see no borders, right, and no arguments between people when you see this tiny place which Earth is in terms of the how space is big. But my last question is, what do you think? How humanity and space industry will look like in next 15 years, especially in terms of manned missions and maybe commercializing them?
Well, I mean, there's a huge push right now to get back to the moon. And so we are going to see colonies. I think we're going to see a permanent presence on the moon in the next 15 years, and we'll probably see a couple of different colonies. And it really harkens back to the age of discovery, you know, in the 1400s to the 1600s. And we need to think back to those days and all of the mistakes that were made and make sure we don't make those mistakes again, some of which we just talked about. But I think we're going to see colonies there. You know, we have commercial space stations being developed, although what I find interesting is we're also seeing robotics becoming incredibly more sophisticated, and AI and computing. And I think we're going to see a rebalance on, well, what's the relationship of robotic missions and human missions? And I'm hoping that they force themselves together to where you have, like on Earth, we're starting to see robots doing the most dangerous things and, you know, humans doing more strategic things. And I think we'll see that in space as we go forward. Whether commercial human space stations will make sense is a TBD, I think. You know, given what you can do robotically versus what you need humans for. And then we're going to look at Mars, you know, and there will be a lot of questions. I think we'll see a real mission headed to Mars in the next 15 years. We'll probably might see a couple of them. I think, you know, questions about long duration in space and their effects on the human body are still a big question mark, and whether it makes sense to have people out there in the radiation. But then, turning back to Earth, we're going to see space supporting the planet more and more. We're already at a point where if something's happening on the Earth, we expect a satellite picture to show up. And that capability is going to grow and grow to where we will really understand our planet. I'm hoping that things like wildfires and natural disasters we're able to respond to and manage much better, you know, and that will improve life. Droughts and famine, environmental monitoring and human-driven climate change. I mean, all of these things can be improved from space. And then, as we talked about earlier, yes, we're going to see significant military capability, protecting our assets. We'll see policing. Hopefully we'll see norms of behavior established so that people know that you can't get closer than this, and that there is a general management as a unified species of space through the UN or through some other agency. So I think that's what we're going to see. There is an enormous amount of opportunity. And you know, we may be at the most exciting point in history in the world of space exploration and space utilization.
Sir, it was extremely interesting what you said, and thank you for this opportunity to give us this interview. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. And many thanks to our viewers. I just want to say that when you look into our playlist section, you can find more English episodes there. So please feel free to enjoy and listen to our other works. Thank you very much.